pitching up in this industrial town in the middle of Madhya Pradesh, I was amazed and delighted to find all these vibrant colour images in seemingly endless proliferation. That then triggered a set of events that made me increasingly interested in the history and nature of these images. I think we have to go back to 1982 when I started my PhD research in rural Madhya Pradesh, and the PhD topic was on first-generation industrial workers, so something seemingly very removed from the world of popular visual culture. But it was during that period of 15 months, ethnographic, largely village-based fieldwork, that I fell in love with the aesthetic of popular Indian visual culture. So my interest was in industrial workers, and I became very fixated on local discourses about the factory. I ought to say this is a Grasim viscose rayon plant, a big continuous production. In the early 80s was booming and was employing about 20,000 people and sucking in a lot of labour from surrounding villages. So I became very interested, fixated almost on local discourses about the Kali Yuga. So one of the things to unravel there was the different connotations of the demon Kali of the Kali Yuga as opposed to the goddess Kali that sometimes then gets conflated with the Kali Yuga. And also the Kali Yuga as the yuga of machinery, of industry. This concern with Kali Yugi discourse was one of the triggers for starting to collect calendar images of the goddess Kali. Prior to starting the fieldwork, I'd already had an interest in iconography and Indian art history, but I think it was a very black and white, sanitized one. I remember one of the key texts that I relied on was Alan Danilou's Hindu Polytheism, which is of course about classical traditions. And so pitching up in this industrial town in the middle of Madhya Pradesh, I was amazed and delighted to find all these vibrant colour images. That then triggered a set of events that made me increasingly interested in the history and nature of these images. So it started by purchasing about 20 Kali calendars. Anything Kali related I was especially interested to acquire. I left these rolled up on a shelf in my room in the village, and a number of villagers expressed concern that they were just lying there unattended, and made it clear to me that they thought this was very dangerous neglect, and that I should unfurl them, hang them or pin them onto the walls, start conducting daily worship. So this then made me aware of the expectations around image use. So images not simply as static repositories of iconography, but as active agents in the world. So I think that was very much the initial spark. And the more images I collected, the more infatuated I became with the aesthetic and the different genres. In the mid-80s, during the rather lengthy process of writing up my PhD, which was at one level about rather dry topics such as absenteeism, labour commitment, overcommitment, undercommitment, all these kind of old chestnuts of Indian industrial sociology. That was all rather dry and dull, and that I wanted to spend more time gazing at these amazing, colourful images. So I think the images got me in their grip. You know, they took hold of me and made me want to acquire more. And then from the late 80s, when I was able to start travelling back to India very regularly, I started to visit publishers and subsequently artists. Some of the key publishers, so we're talking here about 1988 onwards. I think at that point they felt neglected, I suppose, unrecognised, so they were very receptive to having a foreign scholar come and express interest in their work. And many of them, such as Hemchand Bhargava, which was then run by Kishore Lal Bhargava, the three branches of the Brijvasi company and others, very readily donated significant numbers of images. So I was able to expand the collection fairly rapidly through these very generous gifts. Kishore Lal Bhargava, whose offices were in Dariba Gully on Chandni Chowk, taking me to his go-down and rummaging around and finding old sample books and letting me stagger off with, you know, these amazing historical documents, which I've treasured ever since. With Chitrashala steam press, premises of which I located in the early 90s with the help of a footpath picture seller, an amazing elderly, very learned person, V.M. Mote, who directed me to the Chitrashala go-down, where I was invited to go around and take copies of any images that interested me. So these were the days when there was generally very little interest in these as a genre. So similar experiences in Calcutta, at Calcutta Art Studio, in Beau Bazaar, which I'd searched for over several trips. Had not thought to look at the address printed at the bottom of their prints, Beau Bazaar Street. There had a eureka moment when I thought, well, I'll ask a rickshawwala to take me to Beau Bazaar Street, which he did without problem. And then there was a big illuminated sign that said Calcutta Art Studio, in business since 1878. And similarly with Brijvasi, one of the reasons that I'm so interested in Brijvasi's history is that it involves a conjunction of centuries-old practice and absolute contingency. So the centuries-old practice is the Nathdwara Pushti Margi tradition of artistry, of which Brijvasi were heirs, and the contingency is that they're running a framing shop in Karachi in the early 1920s, and in 1928 a travelling salesman from Dresden in Germany calls by and says, why don't you start publishing your own pictures and we could print them in Germany. Just before that, a client had come in with a studio photograph of his son dressed as Krishna, asking for it to be framed. And the Brijvasi brothers sat there thinking, oh, well, instead of just framing this image, why don't we get a painting done based on it, send it off to Dresden, and then we could try selling our own images. And then you have, you know, this very significant transformation of 20th century picture production. Yeah, and other experiences stand out. A trip in 1992 to Shivakashi in South India, pitching up on the train being greeted by the station master, who was pleasantly surprised to have this, what he assumed was a tourist, turning up. I explained my interest in picture production. He sat me down in his office and spent about 90 minutes ringing up every printing press proprietor he knew, and he made a one-week itinerary for me that allowed me to meet basically everyone who mattered in the town. And then that trip memorably ended with one of the printing presses, which, like most of them, were also firework manufacturers, staging a firework demonstration. So there was a single white plastic chair for me set up in this field, and then a huge number of firework explosions for my pleasure. So they were, remarkable, generous encounters with many generous people, which I very fondly remember. So I remember meeting the artist B.G. Sharma in Udaipur several times. I was interested in him because he was the chief motor behind the establishment of the Bombay company Sharma Picture Publication. Started in the mid-1950s with his brother. Sharma Picture Publication really transformed the market because of the boldness and vividness of their colours, a fantastically, almost technicolor, saturated, oversaturated, amazing palette. Other people in the industry, for instance, some of the Brijbasi clan, felt that B.G. Sharma and Sharma Picture Publication had destroyed the industry. So from their point of view, the subtle, nuanced palette of 1930s Nathdwara artistry had been swept away by this brash newcomer in the 1950s, which had made a lot of the Brijbasi work unsaleable. I mean, it suddenly made it look archaic and old-fashioned. But so in one of these meetings with B.G. Sharma, he expressed his puzzlement and annoyance being asked to talk about his work from the 1950s. And he said that he didn't want to talk about it because it was low work, low calm. Work from the footpath, he said. And this was the period when he was being taken up by US publishers for his very fine or refined later work, which found a big, different kind of market in the US. And there were a number of lavish book projects that were celebrating his later work. So there were kind of two B.G. Sharmas, the early one of the footpath, and the later one of a very expensive San Francisco book. And he didn't want to talk about the early one. And of course, if you go to Fatehpuri at the end of Chandni Chowk or Nai Sarak, all the images that are mainly destined for rural areas are all there being sold, wholesaled. So these images circulate through the cities. They're largely made in cities, even if their customer base is increasingly rural. So I'm sure there are areas of subaltern Delhi where you'd find image uses that are very similar to those that I'm familiar with in rural Madhya Pradesh. There are different genres, different subjects that have different customer bases. One figure that has interested me very much is Baba Ramdev Pir, the Rajasthani medieval renouncer king whose samadhi or tomb is at Ramdevra between Jodhpur and Jaisalmer. So he's a very popular figure in parts of Madhya Pradesh that I know, and he's equally popular in parts of Gujarat and much of Rajasthan. But my sense is that he's much less popular in most of Delhi and probably completely unknown among the elite of Delhi. So there are also what one might think of as fast-tracked folkloric traditions and folkloric figures who, through the medium of chromolithography, find completely new audiences. They go from being local figures with very small shrines or utlas to being these mechanically reproduced, mass commodified figures with vastly bigger audiences, which are often also, as in the case of Baba Ramdev Peer, filmically projected. So there's also a local film culture that's promulgating his message of egalitarianism and liberation. So I think there's a lot of diversity in the industry. You know, some of these figures are very niche. I mean, one of the other things that I think B.G. Sharma did in the 1950s was to fast-track probably a dozen or more of these Gujarati and Rajasthani figures that were, prior to his intervention, very localized audiences. And some of them built big audiences, like Santoshi Ma, and others remained very obscure, like Gautarama. So there are lots of goddesses that he painted in the 1950s that basically have faded from the market. Many of these companies from a very early date were very keen to meet the expectations of their Muslim customer base. So a striking feature of the industry as a whole is it's very ecumenical, because it's a commercial industry. I mean, that's the other aspect which I think can't be overstressed, is that it's comparatively non-ideological, because people are making these pictures to make a living rather than promulgate an ideology. They will promulgate ideologies in as much as they think will make them some money, but otherwise they're not interested in pursuing their own personal beliefs. So I think one of the striking things about the industry is it's probably exerted overall a rather moderating influence on Indian political culture. Coming back to the Muslim customer base, my first point of entry was going to meet Yogendra Rastogi in Meerut. So he was initially famous for his Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan mid-60s, late 60s images that celebrated Shastri, but then also drew upon his earlier career as a sign painter, often painting advertisements for irrigation pumps. So this is kind of a green revolution iconography of burbling water pumps irrigating verdant fields in which numerous tractors can be seen, the mechanization, the chemicalization of agriculture, mixed in with beautiful rural women in tight saris. So he became a master of this kind of iconography. Before then, in later life, becoming famous for his superfine Durgas. But in his studio, he employed a guy called H.R. Raja, who had a very interesting career, and I think was initially employed in order to do Islamic calligraphy. That's also the case with Brij Basi. They would employ specialists who could do work that other artists couldn't, were incapable of. But H.R. Raja interested me a lot because, well, in particular, when I first met him in the early 90s, he just produced an image of a muscular Ram above the yet-to-be-built Ram Janmabhoomi, to be built on the site of the just-demolished Babri Masjid. So I was very struck by the paradox of this Muslim artist producing this image. And of course, the lesson to be learned from that was that this was a commercial transaction. It's a commercial picture publishing business. And when you get commissions, it's very difficult to turn them down on the grounds of your own personal convictions. So there's a kind of mobility of identity in the industry that I think is very interesting and in many ways very appealing. One of the lessons I learned in this Madhya Pradesh village was not to boast about having met any of these artists. So I was at the same time as I was meeting these artists and publishers, conducting surveys of image ownership and use within this village. So I was photographing people's domestic displays in their puja rooms, making notes on them. So I came to have a good knowledge of what villagers were buying and how they were using them. In many cases, the images were by artists who I'd recently met. And I'd find myself saying, this is B.G. Sharma, I just met him last week in Udaipur, or this is Indra Sharma, I met him a couple of weeks ago in Bombay. And I was always struck by the indifference that villagers had to them. I mean, villagers just didn't care. I mean, they were completely uninterested. And I think the lesson I learnt from that was that they weren't interested in the authors of the images because they had come to understand that they themselves, as the worshippers of images, were really the makers of the images. Their own labour of ritual devotion, of puja pat, of offering agarbatti, incense sticks, marigolds, nariyal, all these different kinds of offerings, morning and evening, of reciting slokas. Really a huge effort. I mean, it was that effort, of course, that care and devotion that whose absence people found problematic in my curled up roll of Kali posters, in the early 80s. So I think there was a strong sense in the village that it was the devotee that authors the image. So why is this guy going on about the artist that made the image? I mean, this is just a piece of paper. If you look at images at the point of sale, they're all jumbled up. You could have an image of Vishnu next to a laminated poster of Puja Bhatt. On the cart, the theli, where it's being sold, that's completely unproblematic because these images haven't been worshipped yet. They're kind of inert pieces of paper that have to be activated. Activation, it would be a good metaphor for this. A SIM card's a useless bit of plastic until it's connected through the labour of activation. Or installation is stapna, is the local Madhya Pradeshi term. And basically it's the villager that does all that work rather than the artist. Yeah, the Karni Barni or Narakvas. One of the things that interested me about that genre has echoes in other parts of what I've tried to collect, is the mix of enduring practices and radical contingency. So I think what's striking about the punishments in hell images. So basically these are a genre of images that show a deed and the karmic consequences of the deed. So they show action and a punishment as a pair. They also have a kind of fascinating semi-pornographic character that villagers have a lot to say about. The iconography of those images seems to come out of a several centuries old Jain manuscript tradition, but then gets hijacked into mainstream popular Hinduism through the appearance of mechanical reproduction. So print culture is looking for new subjects, new topics, alights on this relatively obscure Jain tradition or Jain preoccupation, and then fast-tracks it within popular Hinduism, where textually, apart from the Garuda Puran, it doesn't really have much salience. So it kind of switches tracks in a fascinating way. And I think the same thing you can see in Baba Ramdev Peer. So many years ago I wrote an article called Accidental Ramdev, and the argument of which was that it was the conjunction of the emergence of the Jodhpur publisher Har Narayan and Sons with the famine relief works that made Ramdevra, Baba Ramdev Peer's Samadhi, suddenly very accessible to road transport, that increased pilgrimage dramatically in the early 1930s, that led to Baba Ramdev Peer entering commercial print culture and, becoming the hugely significant figure that he is today in much of Western India. So I think these conjunctions of practices that have a depth of several centuries with radical contingency, like a salesman turning up from Dresden, or famine relief works making a previously obscure pilgrimage site suddenly accessible by road. When I first encountered calendar art in the early 1980s, especially in political calendars, there were lots of figures I didn't recognise. During my PhD fieldwork coincided with the release of Richard Attenborough's film Gandhi, which I think went to see in Bombay in 1983. And I remember being struck afterwards by the proliferation of images of these two guys, one wearing a trilby, the other twirling a moustache, which there seemed to be many more than images of M.K. Gandhi. And I had no idea who these figures, who I subsequently obviously came to understand were Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad. I'd never heard of them, I'd never seen them. There was no place for them in the Attenborough movie. There seemed to be no place in official history. So that was a kind of trigger for starting to think about what I came to understand as the alternate visual history that I think commercial picture production disseminates. One of the areas I've especially tried to collect are those images that celebrate paradoxically insurrectionary Marxism in the 1930s, or a messianic Braj-inspired landscape, as in many early Brijbasi images that seem to do overt and covert political work that I think tells a different historical narrative than the conventional textual narrative. So I find those images particularly interesting. I mean, if I'm in one of the two main print shops in Nagda in Madhya Pradesh, then I'm always attracted by images of figures I've never seen before, or images I don't understand. I mean, those are always the ones one wants to acquire. I think there are changes, but there's also tremendous continuity. So, there's still a huge market for paper images. It's largely small town and rural. And if you go to Naisarak, in the lead up to Diwali, you'll see hectic scenes of near hysteria as retailers trying to get stock from the wholesalers on that street. But I think that, the digital is obviously having an impact. I mean, most publishers now are photoshopping, reworking older images rather than commissioning, completely new images from artists. So I think the work for artists, for painters, has dramatically reduced. Brijbasi recently reworked an Ambedkar image by Pednekar. So it was a 1950s or early 60s image. They changed the colour of his jacket, altered his glasses a bit through Photoshop, and then issued it as a new image. So that happens a lot. One of the other things I've observed is digital photo iconography at small emergent shrines. Year before last, I visited a very interesting shrine associated with a figure called Om Bana, also known as Bullet Baba, south of Jodhpur, which has power because the motorbike belonging to Om Bana, who was killed in a crash, was impounded by the police and then escaped on 3 subsequent nights to return to the site where its master had died. So Om Bana had recognised as having been drunk when he died, and the site's become a place where local people, well in fact people from quite a wide area in Western India who want to renounce liquor, go and they then pour their final bottle of spirits into the mouth of Murti of Om Bana. And there's a very vibrant photo iconography for sale on about 20 stalls that surround the shrine. So the customer base there is not yet sufficiently large to justify offset lithography production. You know, that maybe will happen in 5 or 10 years. But in the meanwhile, there are lots of local entrepreneurs who are selling numerous, by which I mean several hundred different visual pastiches that combine Om Bana, the motorbike, horse iconography that also references Baba Ramdev Pir. So lots of contemporary and archaic tropes are curled up together in these images. Shivakashi is generally known as, copy artist town. Publishers like Bridgebusy complain that, they put all the effort into innovation and originating, carefully worked out new designs, new but not too new. And then within a week or 10 days, Shivakashi's copied them and is churning them out at, 30% of the cost per piece. So there's quite a bit of annoyance about copying, but I think it's completely internalized in the industry. So everyone expects it and accepts it, and in many ways legitimates it. In, say, the Nathdwara tradition, there you have a historically deep tradition which has basically been about perfection rather than origination. It hasn't privileged newness because these images are designed for ritual use. They are ossified. I mean, to use a term that the anthropologist Maurice Bloch used to use about ritual, it's arthritic. It becomes static. And so that encourages repetition and copying because that's integral to the efficacy of the form. So copying, Bridgebusy has lots of stories about having to try and register their initial images of the Calcutta court, losing lots of important images, being a source of endless frustration. But yes, copying is a central part of the industry. To kind of corrupt a phrase from Frederick Jameson, that everything seems already half seen in advance. So he made this observation that popular music never has a premiere. You never hear a pop song for the first time. It's always half heard in advance. You hear it in an elevator for 5 seconds, or you hear it in a shop for 15 seconds, and then maybe a week later you hear it on the radio in its entirety. But it's always already half heard in advance, and I think one could say the same about commercial picture production. The outcome is always already half seen in advance. So that's another way of, I think, then understanding copying and its utility to what's essentially a ritual practice. I mean, the other thing that's maybe relevant here that I think I learnt from conversations with artists and looking at their archives was coming to understand what I subsequently came to term the recursive archive. So most of these artists maintain quite substantial private personal archives of earlier images. So someone like Indra Sharma in Bombay had 2,000 or 3,000 prints. I remember they were stacked in an alcove, just loose. And they included everything from images that were 100 years old to images that were 1 year old. They weren't sedimented, they weren't stratified historically. They were all kind of equally co-present. And so when he got a commission from a publisher, we want a new Ganesh for calendars next Diwali, he would then go to his archive and he'd pluck out a couple of dozen pre-existing images of Ganesh. And he'd look at them and say, or think to himself, I like that element, I like that element, if I combine this with that. So there's a kind of pastiching going on that draws on the entire history of that print culture, because the archive is not sedimented, it's not stratigraphied by date. So everything is equally alive, everything is an equally potentially valid solution to a new design challenge. The recursive archive, this term I use, was designed to point to that, this kind of spewing out of the past. Because of course the past, it's not imprisoned in the past. And I think that has been a powerful determinant of India's political culture. The messianic, the archaic, is always there present as a potential solution in the present.